What role have they played, these networks, for you?
Well, I think the networks are very important. You know, a lot of these regimes, when they try to split people up and make it look like it's sectarian or otherwise, it's when I team up with someone from Syria, from Egypt, and from, you know, all these other countries, it becomes more difficult for them to display us that way. I think for too long, a lot of these regimes were united in their oppression and repression. And I think it's about time the activists become united against the regimes, because we can be so much more of a powerful force when it comes to fighting for human rights and justice than they can be in their oppression and in their crackdowns. They can only last so long. There's no government that can outlast its people. And if the people have decided that they want freedom, then it's only a matter of time. And I think that if these networks, the stronger they become, the more people become linked in these countries, the more powerful they are. To very quickly also comment on the aspect of whether people want Western interference or not. I get asked this question a lot. I'm not exactly a fan of foreign policy when it comes to the United States or the United Kingdom or these other countries. And people always ask me, well, you're always criticizing them, and yet you go to the United States and you meet with the Congress, you know, ambushed Hillary Clinton once. So like, how do you justify what you do? And I always say, you know, I wish that our countries were in a position where the people were representing themselves. But the fact of the matter is, and the reality that we live in is that these Western countries have an influence, whether we like it or not. And it is our job to try and shift that influence from being a very negative one, which it is right now, into a positive one that actually pressures governments to respect human rights. And that is what we're trying to do. When we're talking to, you know, for example, in Bahrain, we're not asking for military intervention. We're not asking for these different governments to come into the country and decide for the people what kind of government they should have. No, that's up for the people to decide. What we are asking is that these countries that say they have human rights values and principles to actually uphold them. When you do business deals with countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, you're helping enforce the oppression. And that needs to stop. When you're going to do a business deal, tell them, okay, we're going to do a business deal. On the, you know, but you have to stop the human rights violations. And I think that's what needs to happen.
You're taking huge risks in the work that you do. And I mean, fear is definitely not a problem for you. But we were talking earlier on, and you mentioned that you get a lot of death threats. You get a lot of threats all the time. And following you on Twitter, I can see every time you send a message out, you have a lot of people attacking you, and you have been attacked. Can you tell us a little bit more about the situation when it comes to internet activism and the mob of trolls online that the Bahraini government has mobilized?
I think that, you know, by now anyone who works as a human rights defender in the Middle East and North Africa region realizes that death threats and all kinds of other threats come as part of the job. It's something that is not comfortable. It's something that in the beginning might have more of an influence, but with time you learn to normalize it. You learn to ignore it. You learn to push it aside. Because if every time you get a death threat, you're going to sit there and think about how likely it might be that they actually might carry it out, then you're never going to get any work done. And so you have to, like I said earlier, is to push your fear aside and to continue going. I think, you know, the Bahraini and the Syrian regime, they learned from Mubarak's mistakes. Mubarak closed down the internet when the revolution happened in Egypt. And that caused two things. It caused widespread international condemnation, and it caused people to be so curious about what's happening on the streets that they went out to the streets, and it actually raised momentum. Now, the Bahraini and the Syrian regimes, given the fact that this happened later on, realized that that wasn't the solution. The solution was to launch online campaigns attacking people, and spreading misinformation, and defaming activists. And so that's what they started doing. Bahrain is one of the most well-known places for trolls, people that, you know, attack people online. And there was actually this joke that came out. Someone wrote this article making fun of Bahraini trolls, saying that Bahrain was actually going to host the first troll conference in Manama. And the thing is that it's very easy to tell when people are saying something that's legitimate and when people aren't. We have to keep going. And I always say this. And I think that we're in a process. And not everything in our societies is considered okay. It's taken very well. And sometimes you have to push against those limits. And so, for example, I don't only get attacked by people who hate the Bahraini Revolution. And I don't only get attacked by people who hate the Syrian Revolution. I even get attacked sometimes by people who support these revolutions because I chose to have a certain position on something different. So, for example, when the protests in Kuwait happened, some of the people who were leading the protests in Kuwait were actually the same people who supported the entrance of the GCC military forces into Bahrain and were against the Bahraini Revolution for sectarian purposes. But when they decided to come out and demand certain civil rights in Kuwait, I came out and publicly supported them. And a lot of people in Bahrain told me, well, how can you support these people when just a few months ago they were calling for us to be killed in Bahrain? And my message to them was, if I don't stand in solidarity with those who refuse to stand in solidarity with me, then what's the difference between me and them? We have to draw a line that human rights are not based on who you are or what your values are or your religion or your sex or your gender. No, human rights are for everyone. Whether I agree with you or not is not the issue. Whether you support me or not is not the issue. If you are demanding human rights, I will stand by you, regardless of who you are. And I think that's the thing that needs to become more widespread. That this intolerance or this, although, you know, at the same time I have to make this comment as well, is we also have to understand where people are coming from. You know, this position that I take, a lot of people see it as being ideal. And I understand that. You know, if I wasn't so convinced in the idea of being an idealistic human rights defenders, I would probably be just as angry as other people. Because it's not easy to read reports of how your father was physical, psychologically, and sexually tortured in prison. It's not, at the end of the day. And it's not easy to watch a 22-year-old boy who was killed and left to bleed to death. Someone that you were with just hours ago. And then to decide to come out and stand in solidarity with people who are cheering that on. But that's what we have to do, because at the end of the day, our job is to restore the humanity of both the oppressed and the oppressor. And that's how we move forward.
Where do you find the strength?
I always say that if the people of these different countries, whether we're talking about Bahrain or Syria or Palestine or Egypt or others, if they decide that they are going to continue going while they're facing the gun, while they're facing these threats every single day, what right do I have to give up? What right do I have to lose hope? I don't have that right. As long as they're out there on those streets, I have responsibility to keep the same hope that they have. And that's where it comes from.
Thank you. I'm going to let the audience end just in a second. How are we doing on time? Okay. I have one question, and that's, given your dual citizenship, or being Danish as well, what would you say, what could the Danish, the Swedish, or the Nordic governments do to raise awareness or to support the Bahraini plight for justice? What could organizations do? We have a lot of organizations represented here today, individuals, journalists. What can we do to support the situation? Because it is unacceptable, and that's a question that comes to many people's minds.
I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I think that each of these countries is incapable of creating too much pressure on their own. One of the things that gives me hope is I don't expect the United States or the United Kingdom or these other countries to change their policies anytime soon. But what gives me hope is I read not too long ago that the first political institution to boycott apartheid South Africa was the Scandinavian Council. And I know that the Scandinavian Council today has no political power. But this made me come to the realization that we don't necessarily need these big powers to decide to do something about human rights. Why not these smaller countries come together and decide to do something for human rights? Why is it that here in Europe, and as an EU citizen, I sometimes feel very frustrated, because I feel like at the end of the day, as a Dane or as a Scandinavian, it's as if we have to follow in the footsteps of what the United States and the UK decide for us our policies should be towards different situations. And why is that the case? Why don't we create our own map and decide that, well, if the United States and these other countries are going to have double standards towards human rights, we'll create something different. We'll create a separate coalition that will actually stand for human rights. And I think that's what really needs to happen right now. We need to start a discussion. The Bahraini regime believes that they have international immunity. And the problem is that they are right. Nasser bin Hamad, who's the king's son, was allegedly directly involved in torturing some of the most prominent political prisoners in Bahrain. He is so arrogant and so confident, he's 25 years old, that he would introduce himself to his victim while they were blindfolded because he knew he could get away with it. Do you know where he was this summer? He was a VIP guest at the Olympics in London. That's how much immunity they have. That needs to change. When we start seeing talks about consequences, real consequences, that's when these governments will start respecting human rights.
Thank you. So maybe we can actually open up for the floor now, and maybe someone would like to answer the question that you raised. Can we build a pact? Will you also introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. My name is Robert Ord. I'm the Executive Director of a Swedish-based international human rights organization called Civil Rights Defenders. I will actually start by giving you a couple of compliments. First, I was also a friend of Stieg, and I know that he would be so proud if he would be with us today. The second one is that I had the privilege of meeting you in Peru recently. And to explain to the audience, this was an occasion, actually the Assembly of the World Movement for Democracy, where Maryam had one fantastic speech in front of more than 600 human rights defenders from all over the world. And everyone stood up afterwards and giving a big applaud to Maryam. And people around me, including me, were saying that there is a future leader. So I just wanted to say that before I finally come to my question. Can I ask you if you could elaborate a bit about the situation that you're in, living in exile, and what that actually affects your position within the country, within the movement for democracy in Bahrain?
Thank you for your question and your compliments. It's of course very difficult to be in exile. It's a decision that I have to make every single morning when I wake up. I'm privileged at the same time because I'm safer than people in Bahrain. I can travel around freely. I'm also lucky in the sense that I have a Danish passport. A lot of people that left the country don't have another passport and are stuck somewhere or another. So in a sense, I'm very privileged, but at the same time, it's very difficult because when you're inside the country, you're amongst the people. You feel the strength and you live off of each other's strengths. When you're in exile, you're by yourself and you have to keep yourself going. And that, at certain times, does become very, very tricky and very difficult. One of the other obstacles that you have when you're living abroad is you cannot try to lead the movements inside. For example, as a human rights defender I have a lot of followers on Twitter, for example, inside Bahrain. But I cannot give myself the right to ask people to do a certain protest.